There are places around the world where history was hiding in plain sight. A forgotten cave, a buried city, a mysterious tomb, and objects left behind by people whose names have been lost for thousands of years. Some of these discoveries were found beneath ordinary soil. Others were hidden inside mountains, beneath ancient cities, or even underwater. And what archaeologists uncovered sometimes changed what we thought we knew about the past. Tonight, we're going to explore 20 remarkable archaeological discoveries, from ancient homes and forgotten workshops to mysterious burial mounds, lost temples, and objects that survived almost unimaginable stretches of time. These are not legends. They are real archaeological sites and discoveries, each revealing a small piece of a much larger human story. And some of them still leave archaeologists with questions that have no simple answer. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there tonight, and if you're enjoying these quiet journeys through history. Now, let's go back into the ground and uncover the discoveries that history almost forgot. Borobudur's Weep Holes, the hidden water system of Java. High above the green plains of central Java, a massive Buddhist monument rises from a natural hill. Borobudur is usually remembered for its hundreds of stupas, its thousands of carved reliefs, and the silent stone Buddhas watching over the surrounding landscape. But there is another part of Borobudur that receives far less attention, something much smaller, almost invisible. Tiny openings and carved stone outlets built into the monument, designed to deal with one of the greatest threats to the structure. Water. Java receives intense tropical rainfall. During heavy storms, enormous amounts of water fall across the terraces and walkways of Borobudur. For a monument made from thousands of individual volcanic stone blocks, that could have been disastrous. Water could seep between stones, collect beneath the structure, wash away soil, and gradually weaken the monument from within. The builders understood this problem, and they designed Borobudur with an elaborate system for controlling it. Across the terraces are carefully positioned drainage outlets known as jaladwara. Some are simple channels, others are beautifully carved stone spouts. Several take the form of mythical creatures, including the makara, a fantastic animal commonly associated with Indian and Southeast Asian religious architecture. They look decorative, but they had a very practical purpose. When rain fell across the stone floors, water was directed toward these openings. It could then pass from one level to another and eventually leave the monument. In other words, some of the most beautiful carvings at Borobudur were also part of its engineering. The decoration and the function were combined into the same piece of stone. This was particularly important because Borobudur was not built like a conventional temple. It rises from a natural hill and consists of enormous quantities of andesite stone arranged into a massive terrace structure. There are no vast interior halls hidden inside the monument. Instead, the monument is essentially a carefully constructed stone mountain. And a stone mountain in a tropical climate has one enormous problem. It needs somewhere for the water to go. The builders created a system that allowed rainfall to move through the terraces rather than simply collecting wherever gravity carried it. At the corners and edges of the galleries, the carved outlets guided water away from vulnerable areas. Some were shaped like grotesque faces. Others resemble mythical creatures emerging from the walls. To someone walking through Borobudur today, they can appear to be nothing more than architectural decoration. But during a tropical storm, they become part of a carefully planned network. Rain strikes the stone. Water spreads across the terraces. It reaches the channels. Then it disappears through the carved openings. A simple process, but one that was essential to the survival of the monument. The importance of this system became even clearer centuries later. Borobudur eventually suffered from neglect, weathering, vegetation growth, and water damage. The tropical environment was relentless. Rain entered joints between stones. Moisture encouraged biological growth. and water moving through the monument contributed to deterioration of the volcanic stone. When modern conservationists began restoring Borobudur, controlling water became one of their most important challenges. During the major restoration of the 20th century, engineers developed additional drainage systems inside the monument. Pipes, filter layers, and other measures were introduced to help control water moving through the structure. The goal was not simply to remove visible rainwater, it was to prevent water from becoming trapped inside the monument itself. Because once water enters a massive stone structure, it can be surprisingly difficult to control. It can carry tiny particles through narrow spaces. It can weaken surrounding material. And in a monument built on a hill, water movement can affect the stability of the ground beneath it. This makes the ancient drainage system more impressive than it might first appear. The builders were not simply constructing a beautiful religious monument. They were working with the landscape. They understood that Borobudur would exist in a place where heavy rainfall was unavoidable. So instead of trying to keep water away completely, they gave it a controlled path through the monument. That principle remains remarkably familiar to modern engineers. Allow the water to move, but decide where it goes. The small drainage outlets also reveal something about the people who designed Borobudur. They were thinking about problems that might not become visible for generations. A carved relief could survive for centuries. A stone Buddha could remain standing for hundreds of years. But if rainwater slowly damaged the foundations, the entire monument could eventually fail. The drainage system was therefore part of Borobudur's long-term survival. It was engineering hidden in plain sight, and perhaps that is why it is so easy to overlook. Visitors naturally look at the Viking burial mound of Herlaughshaugen along the coast of Norway. On the small island of Leka, a massive mound rises above the surrounding landscape. It is difficult to miss. For centuries, local stories connected this enormous burial mound with a legendary Viking Age ruler named Herlaug. But for a long time, the story remained just that, a story. Then archaeologists returned to the mound, and beneath the earth, they found evidence that suggested the legend may have been pointing toward something real. The mound is known as Herlaughshaugen. It is one of Norway's largest prehistoric burial mounds, measuring roughly 60 meters across. For generations, people had suspected that a ship might be hidden inside, but nobody knew for certain. That changed with modern archaeology. The first excavations took place centuries ago. Historical accounts describe investigations in the 18th century, partly inspired by stories connecting the mound with King Herlaug. Those early excavations were far less scientific than modern archaeological work. Important objects may have been removed or lost. Records were incomplete, and the enormous mound itself remained largely unexplained. The possibility of a ship burial survived, but without reliable evidence, it remained uncertain. Then came a new investigation. In 2023, archaeologists returned to Herlaughshaugen with modern equipment and a much more careful approach. Instead of simply cutting into the mound, they searched for traces that could reveal what had happened beneath it. Among the discoveries were iron clinker-built ship nails along with fragments of preserved wood. These were small objects, but they carried enormous significance, because clinker nails were used to construct Scandinavian ships, and their presence inside the mound strongly suggested that a vessel had once been buried here. The evidence was strengthened by radiocarbon dating. Wood recovered from the mound placed the burial around the end of the 7th or beginning of the 8th century AD. That is earlier than the traditional Viking Age usually associated with famous ship burials such as Oseberg and Gokstad. The discovery therefore became important for another reason. It showed that the tradition of burying powerful individuals with ships was already developing in Scandinavia before the Viking Age reached its height. The practice was older than the word Viking usually suggests. The mound itself is enormous. Its size would have made it visible from a considerable distance, and its location was not accidental. Leka lies along Norway's coast, surrounded by maritime routes that connected communities across the region. A monumental burial placed here would have been more than a grave. It would have been a statement. Anyone approaching the island by sea could see the mound. It marked the landscape, and perhaps the power of the person buried beneath it. This was important in a society where ships were central to life. A ship carried people across dangerous waters. It transported goods. It connected distant communities. And for the most powerful individuals, it could become a symbol of status itself. To bury someone inside or beside a ship may therefore have carried a powerful meaning. The vessel could represent wealth, authority, travel, or perhaps a journey into another world. Exactly what the builders believed remains uncertain. The connection with King Herlog comes from later Norse tradition. According to the medieval writer Snorri Sturluson, Herlog was a ruler from the region who resisted the expanding power of Harald Fairhair. The story describes Herlog choosing burial rather than surrender. Whether the historical person actually existed exactly as the saga describes is impossible to establish. The written account was recorded centuries after the mound was created, but the archaeological evidence creates an intriguing coincidence: a legendary king associated with the mound, and a real early ship burial beneath it. Still, archaeologists are careful not to claim that Herlog himself has been discovered. The mound does not contain a surviving inscription naming its occupant. The human remains have not provided a simple identification. And later stories cannot automatically be treated as historical records. The safest conclusion is more limited. Herlogshaugen contains evidence of an early Scandinavian ship burial. Who was buried there, and whether that individual was the Herlog of later tradition, remains uncertain. The ship itself is another mystery. Only fragments survive. The wooden vessel was not preserved like the famous Gokstad ship. Over more than 1,000 years, moisture, oxygen, microorganisms, and changes in the surrounding soil destroyed most of the timber. What remains are clues, iron nails, fragments of wood, and the shape and construction of the mound. From these pieces, archaeologists can begin reconstructing something that has almost completely disappeared. This is one of the difficulties with Viking archaeology. The objects that survive are often not the objects people originally saw. Wood disappears, textiles decay, food vanishes, paint fades. What remains are frequently metal, stone, ceramics, and traces preserved in the soil. Yet those fragments can still reveal extraordinary stories. A single iron rivet can prove that a ship once existed. A tiny piece of wood can reveal its age. And the shape of a burial mound can tell us how much effort a community invested in remembering the dead. Herlogshaugen also belongs to a much wider tradition of monumental burials across Scandinavia. Large mounds were built in prominent locations throughout Norway. Some contained ships, others held burial chambers, weapons, jewelry, animals, or other offerings. The greatest examples were not simply places where people were buried, they were monuments. They changed the landscape. They created permanent reminders of individuals and families whose influence might otherwise disappear. And that may explain why Herlogshaugen survived for so long. The mound itself became part of the new Göbekli Tepe, finds that may reveal ancient homes. For years, Göbekli Tepe was known for one thing above almost everything else: its enormous stone pillars, its mysterious carvings, and the monumental structures that appeared to have been built thousands of years before the great cities of the ancient world. But there was always another question hiding beneath the surface. Where did the people who built all of this actually live? Because behind every monument, there had to be ordinary life. People had to sleep somewhere, food had to be prepared, tools had to be made, children had to be raised. And now, new investigations around Göbekli Tepe may be beginning to reveal some of those missing spaces. Recent archaeological surveys have identified traces of structures beyond the areas that have already been excavated. Among them are rectangular features that researchers believe may represent ancient houses. The discovery is important because it could change how we understand Göbekli Tepe for a long time. The site was primarily associated with ritual and ceremonial activity. Its massive T-shaped pillars seemed to belong to a world of gatherings, beliefs, and carefully organized ceremonies. But the people who created those monuments were not simply visitors arriving at the hilltop for special occasions. They also had everyday lives. And those lives may have taken place much closer to the monuments than previously understood. The famous pillars are extraordinary. Some stand several meters high. Their surfaces are covered with carefully carved animals, snakes, foxes, wild boars, birds, and other creatures. The effort required to quarry, transport, shape, and position these stones would have demanded cooperation between large groups of people. Yet the monumental structures represent only one part of the settlement. The new evidence suggests that the surrounding landscape may have been much more densely occupied than the visible ruins suggest. Archaeologists have been using modern methods to investigate what remains underground without immediately excavating everything. Geophysical surveys can reveal buried walls and structures beneath the soil. From the surface, researchers can begin mapping areas that have never been opened by a traditional excavation. This is especially valuable at Göbekli Tepe. Only a relatively small portion of the site has been exposed. Much of the ancient settlement still lies beneath the ground. The possible houses are particularly interesting because of their shape. Earlier structures at Göbekli Tepe were often circular or oval. Later buildings became increasingly rectangular. That change may reflect a transformation in how people organized their living spaces. It may also show that the settlement developed over a long period rather than remaining frozen in one particular form. The site was not built all at once. It changed. People returned. Buildings were modified. Older structures were covered. New ones appeared. And the landscape gradually developed into something far more complicated than the first excavations suggested. Imagine the settlement thousands of years ago. The monumental pillars would have stood above the surrounding landscape. But nearby, there may have been much more ordinary scenes. People grinding grain, preparing food, repairing stone tools, working animal hides, gathering around fires, children moving between buildings. The same people capable of constructing enormous monuments were also living ordinary human lives. That contrast is one of the most fascinating possibilities emerging from the new research. It also challenges an older way of thinking about Göbekli Tepe. When the site was first brought to worldwide attention, the monuments seemed almost completely separate from everyday settlement life. They were extraordinary structures created by people who were often described as hunter-gatherers. This raised an important question. How could communities without cities or large agricultural societies organize construction on such a scale? But the discovery of possible domestic areas suggests that the answer may be more complicated. Perhaps the people were living at or around the site for extended periods. Perhaps gatherings were much larger and more frequent than previously assumed, and perhaps the distinction between a sacred place and a living settlement was never as clear as we imagine today. There is already evidence that everyday activities took place around Göbekli Tepe. Archaeologists have recovered stone tools, animal remains, plant remains, and other traces of human activity. Later phases also contain structures that appear increasingly domestic. The more researchers examine the site, the harder it becomes to divide the settlement into simple categories. This was not necessarily a place where ritual happened on one side, and ordinary life happened somewhere completely separate. The two may have existed together. The surrounding landscape is equally important. Pompeii's bakery fresco excavation. When people think of Pompeii, they often imagine grand villas, beautiful mosaics, and streets frozen beneath the ash of Mount Vesuvius. But some of the most revealing discoveries come from much simpler places. Places where ordinary people worked. A bakery, a kitchen, a small shop. These spaces can tell us how daily life actually functioned in the Roman world. And one recent discovery at Pompeii has brought that ordinary world back into view. Inside an ancient bakery, archaeologists uncovered a remarkable painted scene. The fresco was found in an area connected with a bakery complex where bread was produced on a large scale. It was not a luxurious dining room, it was a workplace, a place filled with flour, grain, ovens, and the constant labor required to turn wheat into food. And yet, its walls carried artwork. That detail tells us something important about Pompeii. Even places built for work could be carefully decorated. The bakery itself provides an unusual glimpse into the production of bread almost 2,000 years ago. Large millstones were used to grind grain. Animals, often donkeys, were used to turn the heavy stones. The flour was then collected and prepared for baking. Nearby, large ovens could produce substantial quantities of bread. The entire process required coordination. Someone had to bring in the grain, someone had to operate the mills, someone had to prepare the dough, and someone had to manage the ovens. Bread was not simply placed on a table, it passed through an entire chain of work. The fresco adds another layer to this story. Ancient Roman paintings often depicted gods, mythological scenes, landscapes, and wealthy lifestyles. But paintings found in working environments could serve very different purposes. They could decorate the workplace, reflect the owner's interests, or simply make an otherwise functional space more visually appealing. At Pompeii, the boundaries between work and decoration were not always as clear as we might expect. That is what makes these discoveries so valuable. Pompeii was not simply a city of wealthy Romans, it was a living community. Thousands of people lived and worked here: bakers, shopkeepers, craftsmen, farmers, servants, and enslaved people. Their lives rarely appear in ancient historical texts, but archaeology preserves traces of them. A grinding stone, a cooking vessel, a discarded tool, a bakery wall, together. These small details create a picture of ordinary life. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79 transformed all of this. The disaster happened with terrifying speed. Ash and volcanic material buried buildings, roofs collapsed, streets disappeared, and entire businesses were suddenly abandoned. For the people caught inside the city, it was a catastrophe. For modern archaeologists, it created an extraordinary archaeological time capsule. The destruction froze countless details of daily life in place. In other Roman cities, buildings were renovated, objects were thrown away, walls were repainted, businesses changed owners. Evidence of ordinary life disappeared beneath later construction. Pompeii was different. The eruption sealed entire rooms beneath layers of volcanic material. A bakery that might otherwise have vanished into history survived. The ovens remained, the mills remained, the walls remained, and sometimes the artwork remained too. The bakery also raises questions about the people who worked inside it. Roman baking was labor-intensive. Ithaca, the Mycenaean palace of Odysseus. The site is known as Agios Athanasios, sometimes called the School of Homer. Its position immediately attracted attention. The hill stands above the fertile northern part of Ithaca, with views towards several important harbors. From this elevated position, a settlement could watch ships approaching from the sea. It could also control movement across the surrounding landscape. For a Mycenaean ruler, that would have been an ideal location. Excavations revealed walls, terraces, stairways, storage spaces, workshops, and other architectural remains. Some of the structures were built directly into the natural rock. Others occupied carefully constructed terraces. The complex was surrounded by substantial defensive walls. And nearby, archaeologists discovered an underground water source dating to the Mycenaean period. In times of danger, such a protected source of water could have been extremely important. The settlement was not simply positioned for a beautiful view. It was built with defense and survival in mind. One of the most interesting buildings lies on the lower terrace. It has a large rectangular plan divided into several sections. Its arrangement has been compared with the architecture of known Mycenaean palaces at places such as Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. That comparison is important. Mycenaean palaces were not ordinary houses. They were centers of political power. They contained storage areas, workshops, administrative spaces, religious rooms, and at their center a great hall known as the Megaron. If the structure at Agios Athanasios truly belonged to this tradition, then Ithaca may once have possessed a genuine Mycenaean palace complex. But this is where the mystery becomes complicated. Finding a Mycenaean palace does not automatically prove that Odysseus lived there. Odysseus is a figure from epic poetry. The Odyssey was written down centuries after the period traditionally associated with the Trojan War. Archaeology can reveal the settlement, its buildings, its people, and the period in which they lived. It cannot place a name on a throne unless physical evidence survives to identify that individual. And so far, no inscription has been found at Agios Athanasios that says, "This was the palace of Odysseus." Still, some of the discoveries have encouraged researchers to take the possibility seriously. The architecture contains features comparable to Mycenaean palatial sites elsewhere in Greece. Mycenaean pottery has been recovered. Parts of the complex appear to belong to the Late Bronze Age, and the location fits surprisingly well with the idea of a powerful settlement overlooking the surrounding waters. For archaeologist Thanasis Papadopoulos and members of his research team, the evidence was strong enough to argue that this could be the palace traditionally associated with Odysseus and Penelope. But even those claims have been presented with scientific reservations. The identification remains debated. The story becomes even more interesting when we look at the wider island. Ithaca contains several archaeological sites connected with the Bronze Age and later periods. At Polis Bay, a cave known as Loizos Cave was used for religious purposes over many centuries. Archaeologists discovered pottery, bronze objects, and other offerings left by ancient visitors. Some objects date back into the Mycenaean period. Later worshippers even appear to have associated the cave with Odysseus himself. A clay object discovered there carried a dedication to Odysseus. That does not prove that the legendary king once lived on the island, but it shows that later generations believed the island had a special connection with him. This distinction is important. People in the ancient world also searched for connections between their landscapes and the heroes of their traditions. A place could become associated with a famous figure long after that person's supposed lifetime. Stories could shape how people understood the landscape, and once those traditions became established, they could influence where temples were built, where offerings were left, and where ancient visitors believed important events had taken place. Ithaca appears to have developed one of these powerful traditions around Odysseus. The archaeological evidence also reveals a society that was much more sophisticated than the simple image of a remote island might suggest. The Mycenaean Iznik Basilica, the Church of Saint Neophytos. Along the shores of Lake Iznik in northwestern Turkey, the remains of an ancient basilica lie beneath the water. From the surface, there is almost nothing to see. The lake appears calm. Boats pass across the same waters. But beneath them, walls, columns, and fragments of an early Christian church remain preserved on the lakebed. The structure became known as the Basilica of Saint Neophytos. Its discovery was remarkable enough on its own, but what made the site truly fascinating was its connection to one of the most important cities in early Christianity, ancient Nicaea. Modern Iznik was once the city of Nicaea, a major center of the Roman and Byzantine worlds. In the 4th century, Emperor Constantine gathered Christian bishops here for a council that would become one of the most important religious meetings in history. The First Council of Nicaea took place in AD 325. The decisions made during that council would shape Christian theology for centuries. Yet the submerged basilica was built later, and its story belongs to another important period in the city's history. The church was discovered in 2014 when aerial photography revealed unusual shapes beneath the shallow waters of Lake Iznik. From above, the outline of walls could be seen through the clear water. Archaeologists soon realized that these were not natural formations. They were the remains of a large basilica. A Christian church had been swallowed by the lake. The building stood only a few meters beneath the surface. Its location was surprisingly close to the ancient shoreline. Researchers believe the church was constructed during the 4th century AD, although its exact date and history remain subjects of study. Its position near the lake would have made it a prominent religious building in the ancient city. People could have approached it from the surrounding settlement, while the lake stretched directly beside it. The basilica followed a familiar Christian architectural design. A long central nave was flanked by side aisles. Columns divided the interior spaces. At one end, an apse provided the focal point of the church. The building was large enough to accommodate a substantial congregation. This was not a small private chapel. It was an important religious structure. But the church eventually disappeared. The reason may have been connected to one of the region's most destructive natural forces. Earthquakes. Nicaea lies in one of the most seismically active regions of Turkey. The North Anatolian Fault passes through the wider area. Over the centuries, earthquakes repeatedly damaged the city. At some point, the basilica collapsed and was gradually covered by water and sediment. Whether the lake expanded over the structure because of an earthquake, shoreline changes, or a combination of environmental events remains an important subject of research. The discovery also revealed evidence of burials around the church. Human remains were found in the surrounding area, suggesting that the basilica may have been associated with a Christian cemetery. This helped researchers understand that the site was more than an isolated building. It formed part of a larger religious landscape. The church may have served a community whose members wanted to be buried near an important sacred place. The name Saint Neophytos adds another layer to the mystery. According to Christian tradition, Neophytos was a young Christian martyr associated with Nicaea. Traditions about his life describe his persecution and death during the Roman period. The basilica may have been dedicated to him, although the exact relationship between the saint and the building remains debated. If the identification is correct, the church could have served as a place where Christians remembered and honored one of the city's early martyrs. Archaeologists have also recovered fragments of marble architectural decoration, tiles, coins, ceramics, and other objects from the surrounding area. Each discovery helps reconstruct the history of the church. But working underwater creates enormous challenges. Every object has to be carefully documented before it is removed. Sediment can hide walls and floors. Visibility can change quickly, and ancient materials can deteriorate rapidly once exposed to air. The lake protects the ruins, but it also makes archaeological investigation difficult. One of the most fascinating aspects of the basilica is how much of its original layout remains visible. Even after centuries underwater, parts of the walls and foundations survive. The outline of the nave can still be traced. Columns and architectural fragments remain scattered across the lakebed. The ruins provide a rare opportunity to study an early Christian building in its original setting. The church also sits close to one of the most important archaeological landscapes in the entire Christian world. Just beyond the lake lies ancient Nicaea, the city where bishops gathered in AD 325 to debate fundamental questions about Christian belief. The council took place centuries before the basilica was built, yet the connection is impossible to ignore. The same city that hosted one of Christianity's defining councils later became home to churches like this one. Over time, Nicaea experienced political and religious transformation. Roman Oblazowa Cave, the mammoth-ivory boomerang. deep in southern Poland. Inside a limestone cave overlooking the Białka River, archaeologists discovered an object that seemed almost impossible for its age. It was curved, carefully shaped, made from mammoth ivory. And unlike most prehistoric tools, it had a form that immediately suggested something familiar. A boomerang. The object was discovered inside Obłazowa Cave, one of the most important prehistoric archaeological sites in Poland. And its story reaches back more than 30,000 years, to a time when Ice Age hunters shared the European landscape with mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears, and other enormous animals. Obłazowa Cave is located in the Carpathian region of southern Poland. The cave itself is not enormous, but its archaeological record is extraordinary. Layer after layer of sediment preserved traces of human activity spanning thousands of years. Stone tools, animal bones, personal ornaments, and evidence of repeated visits by prehistoric people. Among the most remarkable discoveries was the curved mammoth ivory object. It was carefully manufactured from a large piece of ivory. The surface had been shaped and polished, its edges were deliberately worked, and its unusual curvature immediately attracted attention. The object dates to roughly 30,000 years ago. That places it within the Upper Paleolithic, a period when modern humans were spreading across Europe and developing increasingly sophisticated technologies. These people did not simply make crude stone tools, they worked bone and ivory with remarkable precision. They produced needles, harpoons, ornaments, weapons, and specialized tools adapted to their environment. The Obłazowa object demonstrates just how advanced their craftsmanship could become. But was it really a boomerang? That question is more complicated than it first appears. The object is curved. But that does not automatically mean it was designed to return to the person who threw it. Boomerang-like hunting weapons have existed in different cultures throughout human history. Some were designed to return. Others were intended to travel forward and strike or stun prey. The exact function of the Obłazowa object remains uncertain. It may have been a hunting weapon, a ceremonial object, or something whose purpose has been lost completely. Its material is equally fascinating. Mammoth ivory was not an ordinary resource. A mammoth represented an enormous amount of valuable material. Its tusks could provide raw material for tools, weapons, ornaments, and other objects. But obtaining fresh ivory from a living mammoth would have been extremely dangerous. Prehistoric hunters may sometimes have recovered tusks from animals that had already died. The environment itself therefore provided an extraordinary supply of material, and the people of the Ice Age knew how to use it. Inside Obłazowa Cave. The mammoth ivory object was discovered alongside other remarkable remains. One of the most unusual was a human finger bone. Researchers also found pierced animal teeth and shells that may have been used as ornaments. These objects suggest that the cave was not simply a temporary workshop. People were carrying valuable objects into the cave, using them, and perhaps performing activities that had social or symbolic importance. The cave's location was also significant. The Carpathian landscape provided access to rivers, forests, open areas, and routes through the mountains. For Ice Age hunter-gatherers, understanding this landscape was essential. They followed migrating animals. They searched for food. They moved between seasonal camps. And caves could provide shelter from the harsh climate. Obłazowa may have served as one of these important locations. The environment at the time was dramatically different from modern Poland. Temperatures were much lower. Glaciers covered large parts of northern Europe. The surrounding landscape supported cold-adapted animals. Mammoths moved across open grasslands. Horses and reindeer were common. Predators followed the herds. Human survival depended upon understanding animal behavior and seasonal changes. A hunting weapon made from mammoth ivory therefore fits naturally into this world. Yet the craftsmanship is what truly stands out. Creating a curved object. from mammoth ivory was not simple. The material had to be selected carefully. The tusk needed to be cut and shaped without destroying it. Stone tools were used to remove material. The surface could then be smoothed and polished. Every step required knowledge passed from one generation to another. This was technology developed through experience. The finished object may look simple, but its simplicity hides considerable skill. The discovery also challenges an old assumption about prehistoric people. For a long time, Ice Age hunter-gatherers were sometimes Obłazowa Cave, the mammoth ivory boomerang, deep in southern Poland. Inside a limestone cave overlooking the Białka River, archaeologists discovered an object that seemed almost impossible for its age. It was curved, carefully shaped, made from mammoth ivory, and unlike most prehistoric tools, it had a form that immediately suggested something familiar. A boomerang? The object was discovered inside Obłazowa Cave, one of the most important prehistoric archaeological sites in Poland, and its story reaches back more than 30,000 years, to a time when Ice Age hunters shared the European landscape with mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears, and other enormous animals. Obłazowa Cave is located in the Carpathian region of southern Poland. The cave itself is not enormous, but its archaeological record is extraordinary. Layer after layer of sediment preserved traces of human activity spanning thousands of years. Stone tools, animal bones, personal ornaments, and evidence of repeated visits by prehistoric people. Among the most remarkable discoveries was the curved mammoth ivory object. It was carefully manufactured from a large piece of ivory. The surface had been shaped and polished, its edges were deliberately worked, and its unusual curvature immediately attracted attention. The object dates to roughly 30,000 years ago. That places it within the Upper Paleolithic, a period when modern humans were spreading across Europe and developing increasingly sophisticated technologies. These people did not simply make crude stone tools. They worked bone and ivory with remarkable precision. They produced needles, harpoons, ornaments, weapons, and specialized tools adapted to their environment. The Obłazowa object demonstrates just how advanced their craftsmanship could become. But was it really a boomerang? That question is more complicated than it first appears. The object is curved, but that does not automatically mean it was designed to return to the person who threw it. Boomerang-like hunting weapons have existed in different cultures throughout human history. Some were designed to return, others were intended to travel forward and strike or stun prey. The exact function of the Obłazowa object remains uncertain. It may have been a hunting weapon, a ceremonial object, or something whose purpose has been lost completely. Its material is equally fascinating. Mammoth ivory was not an ordinary resource. A mammoth represented an enormous amount of valuable material. Its tusks could provide raw material for tools, weapons, ornaments, and other objects. But obtaining fresh ivory from a living mammoth would have been extremely dangerous. Prehistoric hunters may sometimes have recovered tusks from animals that had already died. The environment itself, therefore, provided an extraordinary supply of material, and the people of the Ice Age knew how to use it. Inside Obłazowa Cave, the mammoth ivory object was discovered alongside other remarkable remains. One of the most unusual was a human finger bone. Researchers also found pierced animal teeth and shells that may have been used as ornaments. These objects suggest that the cave was not simply a temporary workshop. People were carrying valuable objects into the cave, using them, and perhaps performing activities that had social or symbolic importance. The cave's location was also significant. The Carpathian landscape provided access to rivers, forests, open areas, and routes through the mountains. For Ice Age hunter-gatherers, understanding this landscape was essential. They followed migrating animals. They searched for food. They moved between seasonal camps. and Campos del Paraíso, the Roman Minerva shrine, hidden in a quarry. In the hills of central Spain, a landscape shaped by centuries of stone extraction hides a remarkable Roman story. At first glance, the area around Campos del Paraíso appears to be a place of quarries. Stone was cut from the earth, blocks were shaped, and the material was carried away for construction. But among these ancient workings, archaeologists discovered something far more unusual: a small sanctuary dedicated to Minerva, the Roman goddess associated with wisdom, crafts, and warfare. The discovery is fascinating because the shrine was closely connected with the quarry itself. This was not simply a temple built beside a town. It was a sacred space within an industrial landscape, where people worked the stone every day. The Romans depended heavily on stone. Their cities required enormous quantities of building material. Temples, roads, bridges, baths, monuments, and public buildings all demanded carefully prepared stone. Quarrying was therefore an essential part of Roman life, but it was also dangerous work. Workers operated heavy tools around steep rock faces. They spent long hours cutting and transporting enormous blocks. In such an environment, religion could become part of the workplace itself. The shrine at Campos del Paraíso offers a glimpse into that relationship. Minerva was an especially interesting deity for a quarrying community. She was associated with wisdom and strategic thinking, but also with crafts and skilled manual work. For stoneworkers, those qualities would have carried obvious meaning. Extracting a large block required knowledge of the rock. Shaping it demanded precision, and turning raw stone into architecture required highly trained craftsmen. A shrine dedicated to Minerva within such a landscape may therefore have reflected the identity of the people working there. The sanctuary itself was modest compared with the enormous temples of Rome. That is part of what makes it interesting. Roman religion existed at many different scales. There were grand temples in imperial cities, but there were also tiny shrines used by local communities, workers, and travelers. These smaller religious spaces could be deeply connected to everyday life. A worker might pass the shrine on the way to the quarry. Offerings could be made before beginning dangerous work. Prayers could be offered for protection, or the sanctuary may simply have marked a sacred part of the working landscape. The quarry environment also provides important clues. Large sections of exposed stone reveal where ancient workers removed material. Tool marks can sometimes be seen across the rock surfaces. Extraction points show how the Romans separated blocks from the mountainside. Every mark represents physical labor: hammering, cutting, wedging, and gradually freeing stone from the surrounding rock. It was slow work, but Roman quarrying became highly organized. Experienced workers understood how to follow natural fractures in the stone and reduce unnecessary effort. Once a block had been separated, the work was far from finished. Stone had to be shaped. Edges were squared, surfaces were smoothed, dimensions were checked, and eventually the finished material had to be transported. This required teams of workers, animals, carts, and sometimes elaborate systems for moving heavy blocks over difficult terrain. The final buildings seen in Roman cities often hide the enormous industrial effort required to produce them. The quarry preserves that forgotten side of Roman civilization. And then there is the shrine. Its presence suggests that the people working here did not see the landscape only as a source of raw material. They also gave parts of it religious meaning. This was a common feature of the Roman world. Rivers could have sacred associations. Mountains could become places of worship. Caves could be connected with gods. Roads could contain small shrines, and workplaces could have their own sacred spaces. The boundary between ordinary activity and religious practice was often Hadrian's Villa, the hidden hypogeum beneath the emperor's retreat. The hypogeum. Hadrian's villa was not simply a luxurious house, it was an enormous complex built during the reign of Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century A.D. The estate contained dozens of buildings connected by courtyards, gardens, roads, and underground systems. The emperor could move through the complex without always needing to pass through the areas used by visitors or servants. And that is where the underground architecture becomes particularly interesting. Roman architects were exceptionally skilled at building beneath the ground. At Hadrian's villa, hidden corridors allowed workers to move supplies without disturbing the people above. Food could be transported, waste could be removed, materials could be moved between buildings, and servants could perform much of the work required to maintain the enormous estate while remaining largely invisible. The beautiful world above depended upon a hidden world below. The word hypogeum simply refers to an underground structure, but at a complex as large as Hadrian's villa, these spaces could become remarkably sophisticated. Some passages were narrow, others were wide enough for workers carrying supplies. There were stairways, storage areas, drainage channels, and service corridors running beneath the monumental architecture. The underground network helped transform the villa into something closer to a small city. That scale is difficult to appreciate today. Hadrian's villa covered a vast area. It contained luxurious residences for the emperor and his guests, but also spaces designed for cooking, storage, maintenance, water management, and transportation. Thousands of people may have passed through the estate during its years of operation. All of them required food, water, fuel, cleaning, repairs, and countless other services. The hypogea helped keep that enormous machine functioning. Recent archaeological investigations have continued to reveal parts of the complex that are easily overlooked. Excavations beneath and around the villa have uncovered previously poorly understood spaces and helped researchers reconstruct how different buildings were connected. These discoveries are important because the visible monuments often tell only one side of the story. A grand hall might appear completely self-contained, but beneath it, there could be corridors carrying supplies directly toward kitchens or storage rooms. The architecture above ground was supported by an invisible infrastructure. Water was particularly important. Hadrian's villa contained enormous pools and fountains. The famous Canopus alone created the appearance of an Egyptian landscape in the middle of Italy. To maintain such features, the Romans needed an advanced system of aqueducts, channels, drains, reservoirs, and pipes. Water had to enter the complex. It had to be distributed. And eventually, it had to leave. The underground spaces were therefore connected to the villa's wider hydraulic system. This makes the hypogum more than a collection of dark tunnels. It was part of the engineering that made imperial luxury possible. The marble floors, the fountains, the gardens, the baths, and the enormous pools all depended upon systems that most visitors would never see. Hadrian could admire the finished result, but beneath his feet, workers were constantly maintaining it. There is also something revealing about the separation between the imperial world and the world of labor. The emperor and his guests experienced the villa as a place of beauty. They walked beside fountains. They entered decorated halls. They looked across gardens and pools. The people maintaining those spaces experienced something very different. They moved through service corridors. They carried supplies. They cleaned rooms. They repaired pipes. They worked in kitchens and storage areas. The hypogum preserves traces of that hidden workforce. The underground architecture also helped protect the appearance of the villa. Imagine a formal banquet taking place above. Food arrives, servants appear when needed, dirty dishes disappear, supplies are brought in. But much of this movement could happen through spaces hidden from view. The luxurious experience depended upon making the work behind it almost invisible. That principle was already highly developed in Roman architecture. Hadrian himself was known for his fascination with architecture. He traveled extensively throughout the Roman Empire, Bon Watson Break, the ancient mounds of Louisiana. Watson Break lies in the Ouachita River Basin of northern Louisiana. Today, the landscape is quiet. Trees and vegetation cover much of the area. It is easy to imagine that there is nothing unusual beneath the ground. But hidden among the trees is an ancient arrangement of earthworks constructed more than 5,000 years ago. That makes Watson Break older than many of the monumental structures traditionally associated with the beginnings of civilization. The site contains several mounds arranged around an unusual oval-shaped enclosure. Some of the mounds rise several meters above the surrounding landscape. They were not created by a single enormous construction project. Instead, they appear to have been built gradually, layer by layer, basketful by basketful. Earth was carried and placed exactly where it was needed. The people who built Watson Break had no modern machinery. Everything had to be moved by human effort. That raises an obvious question. Why would small prehistoric communities invest so much labor into building these enormous earthworks? Archaeologists still debate the exact purpose. The mounds may have been used for ceremonies. They may have served as gathering places. Some could have had elevated platforms. Others may have marked important locations within the landscape. But the evidence does not provide one simple answer. What makes Watson Break especially important is its age. Radiocarbon dating places the earliest construction around 3,500 BC. At that time, people in the region were living as hunter-gatherers. They hunted animals, collected wild plants, fished rivers and wetlands, and moved through the landscape according to seasonal resources. The traditional assumption was that monumental construction required permanent agricultural settlements with large populations. Watson Break challenges that idea. The people who built these mounds did not need to live like later farmers to organize large construction projects. Instead, they may have gathered seasonally. Different groups could have returned to the same location at particular times of the year. Food from rivers, forests, and wetlands may have supported these gatherings. People could share labor, exchange materials, hold ceremonies, and then disperse again. The mounds may therefore represent cooperation between communities rather than the authority of a single ruler. That possibility is fascinating. There is no enormous palace at Watson Break, no royal tomb, no written record naming a king, no evidence of an empire controlling the surrounding region. Instead, the monument appears to have been created by communities whose organization was based on cooperation. Hundreds or perhaps thousands of individual tasks gradually produced a landscape that survived for thousands of years. The environment around Watson Break also played an important role. The site was built near an ancient stream channel within a landscape of wetlands and forests. Waterways provided fish and other resources. The surrounding environment offered plants and animals. The location may have been chosen because it was already an important gathering place. The builders were not simply changing the landscape. They were incorporating an existing landscape into their monument. Archaeologists have found evidence of repeated human activity around the mounds. Stone tools, animal remains, fragments of other materials, and traces of ancient occupations. These discoveries help demonstrate that Watson Break was not simply an empty monument. People were spending time here. They were eating, working, preparing tools, and participating in activities that brought communities together. One of the most remarkable aspects. Chapter 12, Japan's Kofun Burial Mounds. The Kofun period began around the 3rd century AD and continued for several centuries. During this time, powerful rulers and members of an emerging elite were buried beneath enormous earthworks. The largest mounds required extraordinary amounts of labor. Earth had to be excavated, carried, packed into layers, and shaped into precise forms. Without modern machinery, the construction must have required careful organization and a large workforce. The most famous form is the keyhole-shaped kofun. Its Japanese name refers to its distinctive design, a large circular rear section connected to a narrower rectangular front section. From the ground, the shape can be difficult to understand. Trees and vegetation often cover the mound completely, but from the air, the geometry becomes obvious. The ancient builders had created a monumental shape that could only truly be appreciated from above. One of the largest examples is the Daisen Kofun in Osaka. Traditionally associated with Emperor Nintoku, the mound stretches for hundreds of meters. It is surrounded by enormous moats. The scale is difficult to comprehend. The entire monument covers such a large area that its shape becomes almost landscape-sized. Today, dense vegetation covers much of the structure. From ground level, visitors can see only sections of the mound, but aerial photography reveals the complete design. The moats surrounding many kofun served an important purpose. They separated the burial monument from the surrounding landscape. Water created another layer of protection and visual separation. Some monuments had multiple moats. Others were surrounded by carefully planned embankments. The result was not simply a grave, but a monumental landscape. Archaeologists have also discovered haniwa around many kofun. These are clay figures placed around the edges and terraces of burial mounds. Some represent warriors, others depict horses, houses, shields, tools, birds, and other objects. They provide a fascinating glimpse into the beliefs and material culture of the Kofun period. The figures may have protected the burial ground, marked its boundaries, or symbolically represented the world surrounding the deceased. Inside some kofun, archaeologists discovered burial chambers containing weapons, armor, mirrors, jewelry, and other valuable objects. Bronze mirrors are particularly interesting because many came from connections with the Asian mainland. The presence of imported objects reveals that early Japan was not isolated. Communities were connected through maritime routes with Korea, China, and other parts of East Asia. Ideas and technologies traveled alongside goods. The burial mounds therefore tell us about more than death. They reveal the development of political power. Building a huge kofun required control over land, workers, materials, and food to support the workforce. Someone had to organize the project, someone had to command the labor, and someone had to decide who deserved such an enormous monument. The mounds therefore provide some of the clearest archaeological evidence for the emergence of powerful political elites in ancient Japan. But there is a major problem. Many of Japan's largest kofun have never been fully excavated. Some are considered imperial tombs and remain under the authority of Japan's Imperial Household Agency. Archaeologists, therefore, have limited access to their interiors. This means that some of the largest monuments remain remarkably mysterious. We can measure them, map them, study their surroundings, examine similar kofun nearby, but we may never know exactly what lies inside some of the greatest examples. Modern aerial photography has become especially important. From above, researchers can see relationships that are difficult to recognize from ground level. Mounds can be mapped accurately. Moats become visible. Terraces can be identified. And groups of nearby burial monuments can be studied as part of a larger landscape. What once looked like isolated hills can suddenly appear as carefully organized. Dide West 1, the ancient iron workshop of Senegal. Iron changed human societies. Unlike stone, iron could be shaped into strong tools and weapons. Farmers could clear difficult ground more efficiently. Woodworkers could produce more precise tools. Hunters could make stronger weapons. And communities with access to iron technology could transform the way they interacted with their environment. But producing iron was not simple. The metal does not simply appear naturally in a usable form. It has to be extracted from ore through intense heating. That required knowledge, fuel, specialized equipment, and people who understood exactly how the process worked. At Dide West 1, archaeologists discovered evidence of this process in the form of iron-working remains. The site contains traces associated with furnaces and metal production. fragments of slag, pieces of furnace material, and other remains reveal that ancient workers were repeatedly processing iron-bearing ore. Slag is particularly important. It is the waste material produced during the smelting process. To an ordinary observer, it might look like nothing more than dark, broken stone. To an archaeologist, it can be evidence of an entire industry. The presence of slag tells us that someone was deliberately extracting metal. Ore was collected, fuel was prepared, furnaces were heated, and the material was processed at temperatures high enough to separate usable iron from unwanted minerals. The process required experience, too little heat, and the iron would not separate properly. Poor airflow could ruin the furnace. Incorrect fuel could reduce efficiency. The people working at D-Day West one therefore possessed a detailed understanding of fire, materials, and metallurgy. Charcoal was essential. Ancient iron workers depended upon wood fuel to create the intense heat needed inside their furnaces. This meant that iron production was closely connected to the surrounding environment. Large quantities of wood had to be gathered and transformed into charcoal. Ore had to be collected from suitable sources. Workers had to transport both materials to the workshop. The furnace then became the center of the entire operation. It was a demanding process, but the finished iron was valuable. What makes D-Day West one particularly interesting is that it helps challenge the old tendency to describe African technological history through outside influence. Ironworking in Africa has a long and complicated history. Different communities developed their own techniques. Knowledge spread between regions. Some traditions may have developed independently. Others may have been influenced by contacts with neighboring societies. But the archaeological evidence shows that African communities were active participants in technological innovation. They were not simply waiting for technologies to arrive from elsewhere. The workshop also tells us something about specialization. Iron production requires time, it requires knowledge, and it requires equipment that not everyone in a community would necessarily possess. The people who worked with iron may therefore have held specialized roles. They may have been skilled craftsmen whose knowledge was passed from one generation to another. Their expertise would have been valuable. A successful ironworker understood not only how to control fire, but also how to recognize suitable ore, how to prepare charcoal, and how to work the metal after smelting. The objects themselves may not survive as well as the production evidence. Iron corrodes, wood disappears, organic materials decay. But slag and furnace fragments can remain in the soil for centuries. That is why an ancient workshop can sometimes be reconstructed from what appears to be industrial waste: a pile of slag, a fragment of furnace wall, a patch of charcoal-rich soil. Together, these clues can reveal an entire technological process. The location of D-Day West one is also important. Senegal lies within a broader West African landscape where ironworking developed alongside changing agricultural and social systems. Communities were adapting to their environments. Farming became increasingly important in many areas. Settlements grew, trade networks expanded, and iron tools could make a significant difference. The ability to produce metal locally meant that communities could create tools suited to their own needs rather than depending entirely on distant sources. Iron was especially useful for agriculture. A stronger cutting edge could help clear vegetation. Tools could be used to work harder soils. Axes could make woodworking more efficient. These changes may seem small, but over generations, they could transform entire landscapes. More efficient tools could support larger communities. Larger communities could create more specialized occupations. And specialized production could encourage wider networks of trade and exchange. Metallurgy, the Greek theater mask found in a Croatian cave. Along the rugged coastline of Croatia, among limestone mountains, deep valleys, and countless natural caves, archaeologists discovered an object that seemed completely out of place, a theatrical mask, not a modern imitation. but an ancient Greek-style sculpture preserved inside a cave. Its presence raised an immediate question. Why would a Greek theatrical object end up inside a cave on the eastern Adriatic coast? And what does it tell us about the people who once traveled through this region? The Croatian coastline was never isolated from the wider Mediterranean world. Long before modern borders existed, ships moved between islands and coastal settlements. Merchants carried pottery, metal, wine, and other goods. Ideas traveled with them. Religious traditions crossed the sea, and artistic styles moved from one community to another. The discovery of a Greek-style theatrical mask provides another glimpse into these connections. The mask is particularly interesting because theatrical masks were an important part of ancient Greek culture. Greek actors wore masks with exaggerated facial features. They could represent different characters, age groups, emotions, and sometimes specific types of dramatic roles. From a distance, the enlarged eyes and mouth would have helped an audience recognize the character on stage. The mask was therefore not simply decoration, it was part of the language of ancient theater. But finding such an object inside a Croatian cave is unusual. The cave environment creates another mystery. Why was it there? Was it deliberately placed? Was it carried into the cave as an offering? Was it hidden for safekeeping? Or could it have arrived through completely different circumstances? Without a written explanation, archaeologists have to examine the surrounding evidence. Caves had many different meanings in ancient societies. Some were simply natural shelters. Others became places for storage. Some were used for burials, and certain caves developed religious significance. People left offerings inside them, returned to them repeatedly, or treated particular chambers as sacred spaces. A valuable or unusual object found in such a setting therefore cannot automatically be considered ordinary household material. Its location matters. The wider Adriatic region was also a meeting point between different cultures. Greek settlers established colonies along parts of the eastern Adriatic. Local communities interacted with them through trade, migration, and political relationships. Greek pottery and other Mediterranean objects have been discovered across the region. These finds show that artistic and cultural influences traveled far beyond the Greek mainland. A theatrical mask could therefore represent much more than a single imported object. It may be evidence of a wider network of contact. Imagine the journey such an object might have taken. It could have been produced by a craftsman somewhere in the Greek world. It may have passed through a workshop, then into the hands of a merchant or traveler. From there, it could have traveled across the Adriatic by ship, eventually reaching a community hundreds of kilometers from where it was originally created. By the time it entered the cave, its original meaning may already have changed. The object also raises questions about theater itself. Did local communities understand Greek dramatic traditions? Did performers travel through the region? Was the mask connected with an actual theatrical performance? Or was it valued simply as an exotic and unusual object? We cannot assume that possessing a Greek-style artifact meant that people copied Greek culture completely. Ancient communities often adopted individual objects while maintaining their own traditions. Cultural exchange was rarely as simple as one civilization replacing another. The cave itself adds another layer to the discovery. Croatia contains thousands of caves created within its extensive limestone landscape. Some extend deep beneath the surface. Others contain chambers that would have been difficult to reach without deliberate exploration. For ancient people, these places could appear mysterious and powerful. Darkness, echoes, water, and unusual rock formations could give a cave a very different character. From the world outside, it is easy to understand why certain caves became associated with ritual activity. Archaeologists therefore pay close attention to the context surrounding unusual finds. A single artifact can mirror Mohenjo-daro, the ancient city of houses. Mohenjo-daro was built around the 3rd millennium BC. At its height, thousands of people may have lived within the settlement. The city was divided into carefully planned areas with streets and buildings arranged according to an organized layout. This was not a settlement that simply grew wherever people found space. Someone had planned it, and that planning becomes especially obvious when we look at the houses. Many homes were built from standardized baked bricks. The bricks were produced in consistent proportions, creating walls that could be constructed quickly and reliably. The use of baked brick was particularly useful in the flood-prone environment of the Indus Valley. Buildings needed to withstand moisture, and the same basic construction principles appear repeatedly throughout the city. Some houses were surprisingly sophisticated. They were often arranged around internal courtyards. Rooms opened toward these central spaces, providing light and ventilation. Some larger houses contained several rooms and multiple levels. Others were much smaller. This suggests that not everyone in Mohenjo-daro lived in exactly the same way. There were differences in the size and complexity of homes, yet even modest houses could contain features that would seem advanced for their age. One of the most remarkable features was water management. Many houses had access to wells. Some contained private bathing areas. Floors were carefully constructed so that water could flow toward drains. Wastewater then entered larger drainage channels running along the streets. The system was remarkably organized. Inside the house, water had somewhere to go. Outside, the streets had channels to carry it farther away. This tells us something important about the people of Mohenjo-daro. They were not simply building houses for shelter, they were designing an entire urban environment. The relationship between individual homes and public infrastructure was carefully considered. A house depended upon the street depended upon the drainage network, and the drainage network formed part of the wider city. Everything was connected. Archaeologists have also discovered staircases, suggesting that many houses had upper floors. In some places, only the lower sections survive. The upper levels disappeared thousands of years ago, but the stairways remain. They provide physical evidence that the city rose vertically as well as horizontally. People were living above ground level, creating additional rooms without needing to expand endlessly across the city. The houses also provide clues about privacy. Many entrances were not positioned directly toward the main street. Instead, people could enter through smaller passages leading toward internal courtyards. This arrangement may have reduced outside visibility and created a more private domestic environment. The city was busy, but the home could remain relatively secluded. What happened inside these rooms is harder to reconstruct. Archaeologists have recovered pottery, grinding stones, tools, weights, jewelry, and other everyday objects. Together, these finds suggest that homes were places of cooking, craft production, storage, trade, and family life. Not every building had the same function. Some may have been workshops. Others may have belonged to merchants or wealthier families. The city contained many different kinds of domestic spaces. One of the most interesting discoveries is how difficult it can be to identify palaces or royal residences. Mohenjo-daro does not provide the kind of enormous royal architecture seen in Egypt or Mesopotamia. There are no giant pyramids dominating the settlement. No obvious palace tells us where a king lived. Instead, the city seems to place considerable emphasis on shared infrastructure, water systems, drains, public buildings, organized streets, and carefully constructed homes. This has led to long debates about how the city was governed. Perhaps authority was distributed differently from the kingdoms of the ancient Near East. Perhaps powerful elites existed but did not express their authority through enormous monuments. Or perhaps some major administrative buildings have simply not been recognized correctly. The evidence does not. Nopa Huaca, the mysterious stone portal of Peru. High in the mountains of Peru, far from the great cities of the Andes. A strange structure has been carved directly into a wall of stone. There are no enormous buildings surrounding it, no obvious settlement, just a carefully shaped opening cut into the mountainside. And beside it, a second unfinished-looking doorway. The site is known as Naupa Huaca. Its unusual design has made it one of the more mysterious archaeological places in the Peruvian Andes. Naupa Huaca lies in a remote valley near the ancient Inca heartland. The surrounding landscape is dramatic. Steep mountains rise around the narrow valley. The stone itself is dark and heavily weathered, and the structure appears almost deliberately hidden within the landscape. What immediately catches the eye is the precision of the carving. A large trapezoidal niche has been cut into the rock. Its edges are remarkably straight. The corners are carefully defined, and the surface has been smoothed far more extensively than would be necessary for a simple, natural shelter. The design is particularly interesting because trapezoidal forms appear frequently in ancient Andean architecture. They can be seen in Inca doorways, windows, niches, and defensive structures. The shape was practical as well as visually distinctive. But at Naupa Huaca, the carving seems unusually isolated. There is no obvious palace, no known city surrounding it, and no surviving inscription explaining why the builders created it. That absence has allowed many different interpretations to develop. Some researchers have suggested that the site may have had a religious function. The word huaca refers broadly to a sacred place or sacred object in Andean traditions. Natural features could become huacas. So could stones, springs, mountains, caves, and constructed monuments. A carefully carved portal within a dramatic mountain landscape would have fit naturally into a world where particular places were believed to possess spiritual importance. But the exact purpose of Naupa Huaca remains uncertain. The carving itself raises another question. How was it made? The builders had to remove large amounts of stone. They had to create straight surfaces. They had to carefully shape the angles. And they had to work directly against the mountain. The result is striking, especially considering the tools available to ancient Andean builders. Stoneworking was already highly developed in the region. Inca and pre-Inca craftsmen understood how to shape stone precisely, but determining exactly when Naupa Huaca was created is difficult. The site is sometimes associated with the Inca, but there is no firm evidence proving that the Inca themselves constructed it. Some researchers have suggested that it could be older. Andean cultures existed for thousands of years before the Inca Empire emerged. Civilizations such as the Chavin, Wari, and others developed sophisticated architectural traditions long before the Inca came to dominate the Andes. Without clear dating evidence, it is difficult to assign Naupa Huaca confidently to one particular culture. That uncertainty is part of what makes the site fascinating. The structure appears deliberate, its location appears meaningful. Its design resembles forms used in sacred Andean architecture. Yet the archaeological context is limited. There is no surviving text telling us who built it, no inscription identifying a deity, no royal monument nearby providing an obvious date. The stone remains, but the explanation is gone. The location itself may provide a clue. Naupa Huaca sits within a mountain landscape where natural features dominate everything around it. The Andes were not simply physical geography to ancient communities. Mountains could have spiritual identities, water sources could be sacred, caves could represent entrances into other realms. Certain places became points of contact between the human world and the supernatural. A carved opening in a mountain could therefore have carried meaning far beyond its physical appearance. Some modern descriptions have called Naupa Huaca a portal. That term is evocative, but it should be treated carefully. There is no archaeological evidence proving that the structure was literally believed to be a doorway between dimensions or worlds. Its function may have been much more familiar. It could have been a shrine, a ceremonial niche, a sacred architectural feature, or part of a larger complex that has not survived. The evidence simply does not allow us to choose one explanation with certainty. There is also an unfinished section beside the main carving. This is particularly interesting because it may reveal something about the construction process. Perhaps the builders intended to create another niche. Perhaps the work was abandoned, Or perhaps the difference between the two surfaces has another explanation. An unfinished carving can sometimes tell archaeologists more than a completed one. Your marble statue of Athena discovered at ancient Laodicea. In the ancient city of Laodicea, among the remains of temples, theaters, streets, and monumental buildings, archaeologists uncovered a remarkable marble statue, a figure of Athena, the ancient Greek goddess associated with wisdom, strategy, and warfare. The discovery was important not simply because the statue was beautiful, but because it revealed another connection between Laodicea and the wider artistic world of the ancient Mediterranean. Laodicea was located in what is now southwestern Turkey. The city was founded during the Hellenistic period and later became an important center of the Roman Empire. Its position near major trade routes helped it grow wealthy. Merchants passed through, artists worked here, religious traditions mixed, and monumental buildings transformed the city into one of the most impressive urban centers of ancient Anatolia. The statue of Athena was discovered during archaeological excavations in this ancient landscape. Although damaged over the centuries, the surviving marble preserved enough detail to identify the goddess. Her posture, clothing, and artistic style provided important clues. The sculpture reflected the traditions of classical Greek art, yet it had been found thousands of kilometers away from the centers where those artistic traditions first developed. That is what makes the discovery so interesting. Athena was one of the most important figures in the Greek religious world. She was associated with wisdom, strategic warfare, craftsmanship, and the protection of cities. Her most famous sanctuary stood on the Acropolis of Athens, but her worship spread far beyond Athens. Across the eastern Mediterranean, cities adopted Greek gods and artistic traditions while developing their own local identities. Laodicea was one of those places where cultures met. By the Roman period, Laodicea had become a wealthy and sophisticated city. Large public buildings dominated the urban landscape. The city had theaters, baths, colonnaded streets, temples, and an impressive stadium. Water was brought into the city through a complex system of aqueducts. The inhabitants lived in a world where Greek artistic traditions existed alongside Roman political power. The Athena statue belongs to that complicated cultural environment. One of the most fascinating aspects of ancient sculpture is that a statue could have several lives. It might originally have been created for a temple. Later, it could have been moved to another building. It might have been repaired, redecorated, or incorporated into a completely different space. Ancient cities were constantly changing. A sculpture that began its life in one location could end up somewhere very different centuries later. The archaeological context is therefore essential for understanding what happened to the statue. The discovery also demonstrates the importance of Laodicea as a center of artistic production. The city was not simply receiving finished objects from distant regions. Local workshops also produced sculpture and architectural decoration. Stoneworkers created columns, reliefs, statues, and decorative elements for public buildings. The presence of an Athena statue shows how closely local artists could work within established Greek artistic traditions. But the statue was not found in perfect condition. Like so many ancient sculptures, it had suffered damage. Parts of the figure were missing, surfaces had weathered. Centuries of earthquakes and rebuilding had altered the surrounding structures. Laodicea experienced repeated destruction from earthquakes, particularly during the Roman and Byzantine periods. Each disaster changed the city. Buildings collapsed, stones were reused, sculptures were buried beneath debris, and eventually, entire sections disappeared beneath the soil. That process is actually what allowed so many ancient objects to survive. A statue standing in an exposed public space could be destroyed or deliberately removed, but once it collapsed beneath a building, it could become protected by layers of earth and rubble. The object would disappear from human view, but not from history. Archaeologists simply had to find it again. Laodicea itself was eventually abandoned. The Oxyrhynchus, the mummy, and the lost lines of Homer. Oxyrhynchus was an important settlement in ancient Egypt. The city flourished during the Greek and Roman periods. People lived here for generations. They bought and sold goods, paid taxes, wrote letters, recorded business transactions, and copied literature. Much of this writing was produced on papyrus, and when documents were no longer needed, they were often discarded. In the dry Egyptian environment, those discarded pieces could survive for centuries. This created an extraordinary archaeological archive. What looked like ordinary rubbish became a record of ancient life. A torn letter could reveal a family argument. A tax document could reveal how much someone owed. A school exercise could show how children learned to write, and a literary fragment could preserve a few lines from a work that might otherwise have disappeared completely. That is where the Iliad fragments become especially important. The Iliad was already ancient when these papyri were produced. The epic traditionally attributed to Homer tells the story of events surrounding the Trojan War, focusing particularly on the anger of Achilles and the conflict among the Greek warriors. The poem was copied repeatedly throughout the ancient world. But ancient manuscripts were fragile. Papyrus could tear, ink could fade, texts could be damaged, and entire copies could eventually disappear. Sometimes, only a tiny fragment survived. At Oxyrhynchus, archaeologists discovered pieces of papyrus containing passages from Homer. Some fragments preserve only a few lines. Others contain larger sections. Their importance is not necessarily in the amount of text they preserve. Even a small fragment can help scholars compare ancient versions of a text. It can reveal differences in wording, spelling, arrangement, and the way the poem was transmitted from one generation to another. But Oxyrhynchus was not simply a library. The site also contains evidence of death. Among the discoveries were mummified remains and burial material. These finds provide another side of ancient Egyptian life. The people of Oxyrhynchus lived in a world where Greek and Egyptian traditions existed together. Ancient Egyptian burial practices continued, while Greek language and literature became deeply established in the region. Later, Roman influence added another layer. The result was a remarkably mixed society. A mummy discovered at such a site therefore raises questions that go beyond the individual remains. Who was this person? What was their social position? Were they Egyptian, Greek, Roman, or part of a culture that combined elements of all three? Ancient Egypt during the Greco-Roman period cannot always be divided into simple categories. People adopted different languages, different names, different religious traditions, and different burial customs. The archaeological evidence shows a society in constant cultural interaction. The papyri provide a similar picture. Some documents are written in Greek, others preserve Egyptian languages and traditions. There are official records, private correspondence, literary texts, and religious documents. Together, they reveal that ordinary people were living within a highly literate, administrative world. Writing was not limited to kings and priests. It was part of everyday life. And then there are the literary fragments. The discovery of Homeric material at Oxyrhynchus reminds us that great works of literature did not survive simply because someone decided they should. They survived because generations of people copied them. Students practiced them, teachers explained them, readers owned them, and scribes reproduced them. Every surviving fragment is therefore evidence of a much larger tradition of reading and education. The Iliad fragments are especially valuable because ancient versions of Homer were not always identical. Before modern printing, texts changed as they were copied. Scribes could make mistakes, words could be altered, lines could be added or omitted. Different local traditions could develop. By comparing papyrus fragments from places such as Oxyrhynchus with later manuscripts, scholars can trace how the poem changed over time. A tiny piece of papyrus can therefore help reconstruct the history of an enormous literary tradition. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about Oxyrhynchus is how ordinary many of its discoveries are. a broken piece of pottery, a discarded letter, a school exercise, a tax record, a torn literary page. These Warham Percy, the deserted medieval village. Warham Percy was established during the medieval period in the Yorkshire Wolds. Its position was well suited to farming. The surrounding land could support crops and livestock, while the village itself developed around a small church and a series of houses. The buildings were mostly simple. Stone walls formed the foundations. Timber and thatch completed many of the structures. From the outside, it would have looked like an ordinary rural settlement, but archaeology has revealed how much activity once filled this quiet landscape. Excavations at Warham Percy uncovered the foundations of numerous medieval houses. Some were relatively small, others were larger and more complex. Their arrangement reveals how the settlement developed over time. Houses were rebuilt, paths changed, buildings were abandoned, new structures appeared. The village was never completely static. It constantly adapted to the needs of the people living there. Among the most common discoveries were fragments of pottery, broken bowls, cooking vessels, storage jars, and pieces of everyday household containers. To us, they may look insignificant, but pottery is extremely valuable to archaeologists. A single fragment can help establish when a building was occupied. Different styles and manufacturing techniques changed over time. So when pottery is found inside a house, it can help reconstruct the history of that particular building. The pottery also tells us about ordinary life. People needed vessels for cooking food. They needed containers for storing grain. They needed bowls and jugs for eating and drinking. These were objects that belonged to everyday routines. Unlike expensive treasures, they were used constantly. Eventually they broke, and the broken pieces were left behind. That is why pottery can sometimes tell us more about ordinary medieval people than precious objects can. A gold item might belong to one wealthy individual. A broken cooking pot could have been handled by an entire household. Its surface may have been blackened by fire. Its edges may have been worn from repeated use. And the soil around it may contain traces of what was cooked nearby. Piece by piece, these fragments help reconstruct daily life. Archaeologists also found evidence of farming. The villagers depended heavily upon the surrounding land. Fields were cultivated, animals were raised, harvests had to be stored, food had to be processed. And the agricultural system shaped almost every part of village life. The medieval countryside was not simply a collection of isolated farms. Villages such as Warham Percy were part of organized landscapes where land, labor, and resources were carefully managed. The church provides another important clue. The remains of the medieval church still stand above the village for generations. This would have been one of the most important buildings in the settlement. People gathered here for worship, children were baptized, couples were married, and the dead were buried in the surrounding cemetery. The church connected the villagers not only with their community, but with the wider religious world of medieval England. Archaeologists discovered hundreds of burials around the church. These skeletons have provided an extraordinary amount of information about the people who lived at Warham Percy. Bones can reveal age, sex, signs of disease, injuries, physical stress, and sometimes the kinds of work people performed during their lives. The village therefore preserves not just buildings, but the people who occupied them. Some remains show evidence of difficult lives. The medieval countryside could be harsh. People faced disease, poor harvests, injuries, and limited medical treatment. Physical activity also left marks on the skeleton. The bodies buried at Warham Percy reveal that medieval rural life demanded considerable physical effort. Farming was exhausting work, and survival depended heavily on the success of each year's harvest. But eventually, the village began to decline. This did not happen overnight. Some houses were abandoned, others were demolished. Fields were reorganized, population decreased, and the settlement gradually became smaller. One major factor appears to have been changes in the organization of agriculture. Landowners increasingly favored sheep farming in some areas. Sheep required less labor than intensive arable farming. As a result, some medieval villages lost much of their population. By the 16th century, Warham Percy had largely disappeared as a living village. The church remained in use for a time, but the houses were gone. Fields and pasture gradually covered the remains. The settlement that had once contained families, workshops, animals, and busy household activity became a landscape of ruins. For centuries, there was little visible evidence of what had happened. Then archaeology began to uncover the village. Excavators carefully removed layers of soil, walls emerged, floors appeared, pottery fragments were collected, animal bones were recorded, and gradually, the shape of the medieval settlement returned. The remarkable thing about Warham Percy is that the discoveries are not dominated by one spectacular object. There is no enormous royal treasure, no mysterious monument, no legendary artifact. The massive 3,500-year-old Bronze Age axe. The discovery was made near Berghem-Limental, close to the modern Swiss-French border. The axe was found during a systematic archaeological survey carried out with the local archaeology authorities nearby. Another bronze object was discovered, a small garment pin, and this was not the first Bronze Age object ever found in the area. A bronze sickle had already been reported from the same rocky formation more than a century ago. Suddenly, the hillside looked much less ordinary. The axe itself is remarkable. It was cast from solid bronze. It is unusually heavy for its size, and its workmanship is exceptionally careful. Archaeologists classify it as a Grenchen-type flanged axe, a form associated with the Middle Bronze Age. The name comes from another Swiss discovery at Grenchen, where a Bronze Age deposit containing axes, sickles, and part of a sword was found in the 19th century. These similarities suggest that the axe belonged to a broader technological tradition. It was not an isolated invention. Its design was part of a much wider network of Bronze Age metalworking. But the most interesting part may not be the axe itself. It is where the axe was found. The object was lodged inside a natural rock pocket filled with soil. It was not lying openly on the surface. It had been placed inside the landscape. And that raises an important possibility. Perhaps someone deliberately put it there. During the Bronze Age, people across Europe sometimes buried valuable metal objects, axe, weapons, jewelry, and tools were placed in the ground inside rock crevices or in other unusual locations. Archaeologists often interpret some of these deposits as ritual offerings. The objects may have been given to supernatural powers, or deliberately removed from everyday use for reasons we can no longer understand. The Swiss axe may belong to this tradition, but researchers are careful. They cannot yet say exactly why it was buried. There is another possibility. Perhaps the axe was once part of a larger collection, the nearby bronze pin, the earlier bronze sickle. And other reported finds from the same area raise the possibility that more objects were originally deposited here. Over thousands of years, a hoard could have been disturbed. Some objects might have been removed. Others could have been scattered by natural processes. And some may still remain beneath the ground. So the axe could be a surviving piece of something much larger. The location itself is also important. Today, Berghem-Limental is a quiet community near the Swiss-French border. But 3,500 years ago, this region was connected to important routes through Central Europe. The landscape provided fertile land. Rivers and valleys connected different regions, and routes led toward both the Rhine and Rhone valleys. People, objects, and ideas could move through these corridors. The bronze axe may therefore be evidence of a much wider network. Bronze itself was a valuable technology. It required knowledge of metallurgy, access to copper and tin, and the ability to control high temperatures. The raw materials did not necessarily come from the same place where an object was manufactured. Copper and tin could travel long distances before reaching a craftsman's workshop. That means a single bronze axe can represent a chain of connections stretching across large parts of Europe. The craftsman who created this axe understood exactly how the metal behaved. The bronze had to be melted. A mold had to be prepared. The molten metal had to be poured carefully. After casting, the axe could be finished and sharpened. Small imperfections had to be removed. The final result was a functional object, but also a demonstration of specialized knowledge. And an axe like this could have been extremely valuable. It represented labor, raw materials, technical skill, and perhaps social status. Whether it was used in everyday work, carried as a weapon, or reserved for a special purpose, we cannot know from the object alone. Its final position in the earth may actually tell us more about how people valued it. Someone eventually decided that it should no longer remain in the human world. That is what makes Bronze Age deposits so difficult to interpret. An object found underground might have been hidden for safekeeping. It could have been buried during a time of danger. It might have been deliberately offered to a deity, or it could have been placed there as part of a ceremony whose meaning has completely disappeared. The archaeology gives us possibilities, but not the thoughts of the person who buried it. The discovery also connects with another important Bronze Age find just across the modern border, in Biederthal, France. A much larger Bronze Age hoard was discovered in 1998. It was only around a kilometer from the Swiss find. Together, these discoveries suggest that the region may have been particularly important during the Middle Bronze Age. It may have been a place of settlement, trade, movement, or ritual activity, perhaps all four. The landscape has changed enormously since then. Forests have grown, paths have moved, villages have appeared. Modern borders now divide Switzerland and France. But the Bronze Age did not recognize those borders. The people who lived here belonged to communities connected by trade and movement across the region. The same types of objects could travel from the 3,500-year-old Bronze Age wooden well. For more than 3,000 years, a wooden structure was hidden beneath the soil of England. Not a palace, not a burial chamber, just a well, built by people living during the Bronze Age. And somehow, the wood survived. When archaeologists finally uncovered it, they found a remarkably preserved structure that offered a rare glimpse into how prehistoric communities managed one of the most important resources of all: water. The well was discovered in Oxfordshire during archaeological work connected with a development project. At first, there was little reason to expect anything extraordinary beneath the ground, but excavation revealed a deep cut into the ancient landscape, and inside it, timbers had been carefully positioned to create a wooden-lined well. The structure was approximately 3,500 years old. That places its construction during the Middle Bronze Age. For people living at that time, access to reliable water could determine where a settlement was established. Rivers and streams were obvious sources. But a well offered something different. It allowed people to reach groundwater directly. That could be especially valuable during periods when surface water became difficult to access. The builders therefore had to understand their local landscape. They needed to know where water could be reached, and they needed to create a structure strong enough to prevent the sides from collapsing. The construction of the well was surprisingly practical. Timber was placed within the excavated shaft to reinforce its sides. The wooden framework helped keep the surrounding earth from falling inward. It also created a protected space where people could collect water. This may sound simple, but digging deeply into unstable ground without modern equipment was dangerous work. A collapse could trap workers underground. The builders had to work carefully, removing soil while strengthening the shaft as they went. The survival of the wood is one of the most remarkable parts of the discovery. Normally, wood disappears quickly from archaeological sites. Rain, oxygen, microorganisms, and changing soil conditions gradually destroy it. But when timber becomes buried in waterlogged conditions, oxygen can be severely limited. that can slow the processes that normally cause wood to decay. In the right environment, ancient timber can survive for thousands of years, and that is exactly what happened here. The preserved wood allows archaeologists to study the construction in much greater detail than would be possible from soil alone. They can examine the species of timber, study how the pieces were shaped, look at the joins, and understand how the builders assembled the structure. Every cut and connection provides evidence of the techniques available to Bronze Age craftsmen. These were people who understood wood as a construction material and knew how to work it efficiently. But the well may tell us more than how people obtained water. The surrounding archaeological evidence can reveal what was happening in the landscape at the time. Bronze Age communities were farming, they raised animals, they cultivated crops, they produced pottery, they made tools, and they traveled through increasingly organized landscapes. A reliable water source could support all of these activities. People needed water for themselves, for animals, and for many forms of daily work. The well also gives us a glimpse into something rarely preserved in archaeology. Ordinary infrastructure. Ancient monuments tend to attract attention. Burial mounds, stone circles, weapons, and precious objects are easier to recognize as important. But people could not have lived without practical systems. They needed water. They needed food storage. They needed shelters. They needed tools. And they needed ways to manage their environment. The wooden well represents that quieter side of prehistoric life. There is something almost strange about discovering such an ordinary object after thousands of years. The person who built it probably never imagined that anyone would remember the structure. They were simply solving a problem. They needed water. So they built a well. The work was probably carried out with familiar tools and techniques passed through generations. Once the well was finished, people would return to it again and again. Buckets would descend, water would be collected, animals may have been brought nearby, children may have stood around its edge. It was part of everyday life. Eventually, something changed. The well stopped being used. Perhaps the water supply became unreliable. Perhaps the settlement moved. Perhaps the true age of Pacific coral homes. For years, archaeologists could see the coral houses scattered across the islands of French Polynesia. They could study the walls, the foundations, the objects left inside. But there was one frustrating problem. How old were these buildings exactly? The answer seemed simple, until researchers discovered that the usual dating methods could not provide the precision they needed. Now, a new technique has finally begun to reveal when these remarkable coral homes were actually built. The research focused on the Mangareva Islands, a group of volcanic islands surrounded by coral reefs in the South Pacific. For generations, coral was an important building material here. Local communities constructed houses, churches, schools, bread ovens, watchtowers, and other structures using coral gathered from nearby reefs and exposed coastal formations. Many of these buildings date to the period after European missionaries arrived during the 19th century. But the exact construction dates of individual buildings were often difficult to establish. European missionaries kept records about their own buildings, but much less was written about the ordinary homes built by local Mangarevan families. That created a major gap in the archaeological record. Researchers could see the buildings, but they could not always place them precisely within the changing history of the islands. And when studying cultural change, even a difference of a few decades can matter. The breakthrough came from an unusual source, the coral itself. Researchers used uranium-thorium dating, or UTH dating, to determine when the coral used in the buildings had been removed from the living reef. The technique had already been used to study ancient coral and cave formations, but this was the first time it was applied specifically to historical coral architecture, and the results were surprisingly precise. Unlike radiocarbon dating, which can be unreliable for relatively recent materials, UTH dating can provide dates accurate to within just a few years in suitable coral samples. That means researchers can begin building much more detailed timelines. Instead of simply saying that a house belonged to the 19th century, they can potentially determine when its construction materials were gathered and used. That changes what can be asked about these buildings. The results also produced an unexpected discovery. Several coral blocks were older than researchers initially expected. A few even appeared to predate European arrival. At first, that might suggest the buildings themselves were much older. But there is another possibility. The builders may have reused older coral that had already been taken from nearby locations. In other words, an old piece of coral does not necessarily mean an old house. It could mean that an old building material was given a second life. Interestingly, the samples did not show the enormous differences in age that some earlier theories had suggested. The evidence therefore challenges the idea that 19th century coral buildings were commonly constructed from coral taken from structures that were centuries older. Instead, the story appears to be more complicated. Some older material may have been reused, but the widespread reuse of extremely ancient coral is not supported by these results. The houses themselves reveal another side of the story. Archaeologists have found evidence of everyday activities inside and around the coral structures. Cooking pots, ceramics, glassware, and other household objects provide clues about how families lived. Some areas even contain evidence connected with large communal meals or feasting. These are not just buildings. They are records of domestic life. Think about what a house can tell us: where people prepared food, how they ate, where they slept, how they moved through their living spaces, where they gathered, and how religious practices may have entered the home. A building's walls can preserve these patterns, but only if archaeologists can place the building within a reliable timeline. That is why the new dating technique matters so much. The coral itself contains another hidden record, each piece formed as a living organism within a reef. Its chemistry reflects the environment in which it grew. That means a coral block used in a house is more than construction material. It can potentially preserve information about the reef that produced it. Ancient environmental conditions, changes in the surrounding ecosystem, and even long-term changes in coral environment.